Climbing Mount Everest is no walk in the park. It's a deadly challenge where even the smallest mistake can mean disaster. But some climbers push the limits, making reckless decisions such as ignoring weather warnings, skipping safety gear, or going solo without experience. These aren't just bad moves, they're a death sentence. In this video, we'll show what happens when climbers make the worst decisions possible on the world's highest peak. For our first story, we'll start with perhaps the most famous Everest disaster. On May 10, 1996, Mount Everest witnessed one of its deadliest disasters. 8 climbers lost their lives, spread across multiple expeditions, as a storm swept through the mountain, trapping them in the notorious death zone. The 1996 disaster is infamous, not just because of the deaths, but because of the avoidable mistakes that were made along the way. Rob Hall was a seasoned guide. He had summited Everest multiple times, guiding many clients to the top. This time, however, things were different. Time was slipping away and a looming storm was on the horizon. Yet Hall pressed on, driven by his promise to his client, Doug Hansen. Doug, a postal worker who had been turned back just shy of the summit the year before, was determined to make it this time. Doug's relentless drive became a dangerous anchor for Hall, dragging both men into perilous territory. As the golden rule dictated, climbers were supposed to turn back by 2 p.m. Any later, and the descent would become a race against darkness, dwindling oxygen, and the unpredictable mountain weather. But for Doug and Rob, that crucial time passed, and they had not yet reached the summit. Hall, normally cautious, made a fateful decision. He chose to keep going, prioritizing his client's dream over the harsh realities of Everest. By the time they summited, it was late in the day, with dark skies already closing in. The descent began, but Doug quickly ran into trouble. His oxygen was running low, and his body was shutting down. He collapsed near the Hillary step, unable to go any further. Rob, refusing to abandon his client, stayed with him, even as the storm hit with full force. A radio call was made to base camp, but there was no help to send. Everyone was trapped by the storm. Doug succumbed to the cold and altitude, and Rob was left alone. In one final act, Hall called base camp again to speak to his pregnant wife, telling her he loved her. Shortly after, he too was overtaken by the storm and perished high on the mountain. But this wasn't the only tragedy that day. On another expedition, led by Scott Fisher of Mountain Madness, things were also spiraling out of control. Fisher, a renowned climber with a reputation for resilience, had guided his clients up the mountain as well. But by the time the storm rolled in, Fisher was in trouble. Already exhausted from the climb and suffering from altitude sickness, he found himself stranded high on the mountain. Fisher's lead Sherpa, Lobsang Jangbu, had stayed with him as long as he could, but even he was running out of strength. Fisher was too weak to continue, and Lobsang had to make the agonizing decision to leave his leader behind in an attempt to save his own life. Fisher, like Doug Hansen, succumbed to the unforgiving cold and thin air of the death zone. His body was found days later. Elsewhere on the mountain, other climbers were also fighting for survival. Yasuko Namba, a Japanese climber and one of Rob Hall's clients, had summited earlier that day. But as the storm intensified, she became disoriented and collapsed. Beck Weathers, another climber on Hall's team, was also in critical condition, suffering from severe frostbite and snow blindness. The pair had been left behind by others trying to get down the mountain, their survival hanging by a thread. Beck, against all odds, survived. He spent hours in the freezing storm, only to be found barely alive the next morning by a group of climbers who had assumed he was dead. His face was frostbitten beyond recognition, and he would later lose his nose and parts of his hands to the frostbite. Yasuko, however, wasn't as lucky. She died that night, her body left on the mountain. By the end of May 11th, 8 climbers had died, spread across 3 expeditions. The disaster wasn't just a result of bad weather, it was the culmination of a series of poor decisions. Rob Hall and Scott Fisher both made the critical mistake of allowing their teams to summit too late in the day. They ignored the turnaround time, a decision that proved fatal. The traffic jam of climbers, delayed rope fixings, and the underestimation of the storm all contributed to the disaster. It was Everest's cruel lesson. On this mountain, ambition can be deadly. But Everest, indifferent to human life, had claimed others before, and would claim many more. In fact, high up on the same southern route Rob and Doug had taken, there was another eerie presence, a ghostly figure that had haunted climbers for years. Her name was Hannelore Schmatz, and she had died long before Rob Hall's ill-fated expedition in the autumn of 1979. Hannelore, a tough German climber, had made it to the summit of Everest alongside her husband, Gerhard Schmatz, who was leading their expedition. She became the fourth woman ever to stand on the roof of the world, but like many before her, she didn't realize that reaching the summit was only half the battle. The descent is when the mountain decides if it will let you live or not. Gerhard had already made his summit a day earlier. As the weather started to deteriorate, he warned Hannelore and her team via walkie-talkie that conditions were worsening, advising them to turn back. But Hannelore, driven and determined, decided to push on. As they made their way down, night began to fall, and exhaustion gnawed at Hannelore and her American teammate, Ray Janae. They were dangerously high, at around 28,000 feet, just below the summit, when their bodies demanded rest. The Sherpas with them, knowing all too well how unforgiving Everest could be, begged them not to stop. Even Gerhard's warnings from lower down couldn't persuade them. But Hannelore and Ray, too worn out to continue, made the fatal decision to bivouac right there on the mountainside, exposed to the elements, hoping they could survive the night. They couldn't. Gerhard, at lower altitudes, was powerless to help and could only wait for updates. Ray Janae was the first to go, his body shutting down in the bitter cold. Hannelore, barely holding on, was overcome by the freezing winds. By morning, she was too weak to move. Her Sherpa urged her to get up, to keep going, but it was too late. She sat down, leaned against her pack, and with her final breath whispered, "Water, water," before succumbing to the cold. The Sherpa stayed with her, refusing to abandon her, even though he knew it would cost him dearly. His fingers and toes were ravaged by frostbite, and Hannelore, her body remained there on the mountain, frozen in place for years. Climbers passing by would see her, sitting upright, eyes open, hair blowing in the wind, a haunting sentinel watching over the southern route. Her body became infamous. Some who encountered it mistook her for a fellow climber resting before realizing with horror that she was long gone. Her husband Gerhard made it down safely, but he had lost his wife to a bad decision, the decision to stop when they should have kept moving. Resting in the death zone is never an option. Even the hardiest of climbers can't survive the freezing temperatures and thin air at that altitude. If they had pushed on just a little further, maybe she would have survived. But Everest doesn't care about maybes. Hannelore's body stayed there for years, a grim reminder to all who passed her, until one day, the wind swept her over the edge of the mountain. Everest had claimed another, just one more soul lost in the ice, but the mountain wasn't done. It was May 2016, and a team from West Bengal, India, was preparing for their final push to the summit. Gautam Ghosh, Subhas Paul, Paresh Nath, and Sunita Hazra had been planning this for years. They knew the risks. They knew how quickly the weather could turn, how thin the air became at that altitude. But ambition does strange things to people, and the decisions they made in the coming days would lead to one of Everest's deadliest lessons. On May 20th, they left Camp 4 in the evening, aiming to summit the next morning. Already they were breaking one of the cardinal rules of climbing Everest: start early and finish early. The later you summit, the more you risk being caught in bad weather on the way down. It was their first mistake, but far from the last. They reached the balcony around 5 a.m., but not everyone was there. Subhas and his Sherpa had gotten separated from the group. For 2 hours, Sunita, Gautam, and Paresh waited for them. 2 hours lost at one of the highest points on Earth, where every second counts. When the others didn't show, they continued without them. Another bad decision followed. Paresh, who was struggling, was advised to turn back, but he refused, determined to reach the top. He was climbing without his Sherpa, and that left him vulnerable. Everest doesn't care about your determination. He pressed on, another dangerous choice piling onto the rest. Soon, Paresh was falling behind, and Pashang Sherpa, who had been guiding them, disappeared. Sunita, Gautam, and Bishnu Sherpa reached the summit, but they were late, dangerously late. They stayed too long, taking in the view, burning precious energy they would need to get down. By the time they started their descent, the mountain had already begun to turn against them. The mistake was clear. They had ignored the turnaround time. You don't stay that high on Everest after 2 p.m., and they had. The decision would cost them dearly. On the way down, things quickly unraveled. Sunita and Gautam found Pashang Sherpa, but now they were without oxygen. Bishnu Sherpa, who had stayed with them, decided to leave. Gautam and Sunita were alone, oxygen running out, energy fading. They passed Paresh, sitting just above the south col, alone, exhausted, and without his Sherpa. Paresh was still alive, but barely. Sunita overtook him, unable to stop. Everest has a way of forcing your hand. By the time night fell, Gautam had self-anchored just below the balcony, trying to hold on. But the cold took him. He likely passed away quietly during the night, alone in the vast silence of the mountain. Sunita, frostbitten and barely conscious, was stumbling down when British climber Leslie John Binns found her. He was on his own summit push, but gave it up to save her, bringing her back to Camp 4. Paresh, though alive when they last saw him, didn't make it. He was found alive the next day, but died shortly after. This tragedy could have been avoided. The team ignored critical advice. They climbed too late, waited too long, and didn't turn back when they should have. The biggest mistake, letting summit fever take over. If they had turned around when advised, all four might have lived. Everest doesn't care how many times you try. Nobukazu Kuriki, a Japanese climber, knew that better than most. By May 2018, he had already failed 7 times to summit the mountain. Everest was an obsession, a goal that kept slipping through his fingers, literally. During a previous attempt in 2012, he lost almost all his fingers to frostbite. But that didn't stop him. On his 8th attempt, he set off again. This time, he tried from the Nepalese side, taking the West Ridge, one of the more challenging routes. It was ambitious, maybe too ambitious, for a man who couldn't fully use an ice axe, one of the most critical tools for climbing safely. The climb seemed to be going well at first. Kuriki reached 7,400 meters, high on the mountain, but then things took a turn. He began to feel ill. His body, weakened from the climb and from years of frostbite damage, couldn't handle the altitude anymore. He needed to descend, and fast. But he waited too long. Another bad decision. When you start feeling symptoms of altitude sickness, you descend immediately. Kuriki didn't. By the time his team realized something was wrong, it was too late. He stopped responding to radio calls, and his headlamp disappeared in the dark. A search team was sent up, but when they found him, he was already gone. Another climber claimed by Everest's icy grip. Kuriki's mistake was waiting. Had he descended sooner, he might have survived. But like so many others, he underestimated the mountain, and it cost him everything. Everest does not care how many times you try, or how much you want to stand at the top. It takes only one mistake to end it all. Maurice Wilson wasn't like the others. While most Everest climbers spent years honing their mountaineering skills, he had a different plan, one based on faith, fasting, and sheer willpower. By the time he set his sights on Mount Everest in 1934, no one had ever successfully reached the summit. The closest anyone had come was Mallory and Irvine, whose tragic disappearance in 1924 at around 8,600 meters remained a mystery. Climbers before Wilson had faced avalanches, oxygen deprivation, and deadly storms. Despite this, Wilson, a man with zero mountaineering experience, believed that faith and fasting would get him to the top. Wilson wasn't just any ordinary adventurer. He had served in World War I, earning the Military Cross for bravery after holding a machine gun post alone against the Germans. But post-war life left him adrift. It wasn't until he found a spiritual path through fasting and prayer that he regained his purpose. And what better way to demonstrate his newfound conviction than by tackling the world's tallest, deadliest mountain? The idea seemed absurd to anyone with an ounce of mountaineering knowledge. Wilson didn't just lack climbing experience, he didn't even know how to use an ice axe or crampons. His preparation for the climb? 5 weeks walking the hills of Snowdonia and the Lake District. That's like training for a marathon by doing a few laps around your neighborhood. But Wilson's belief in the power of faith over physical limits drove him forward. His plan was as wild as his ambition. He bought a small plane, named it Everest, and attempted to fly from England to Tibet, crash land near the summit, and simply walk the rest of the way up. Unsurprisingly, this didn't go well. After several crashes, British authorities grounded him, confiscating his plane in India. But Wilson wasn't easily discouraged. He trekked across India and Tibet on foot, sneaking into the country dressed as a monk. With 3 Sherpas by his side, he finally reached the Rongbuk Monastery, the starting point for many Everest expeditions. From the start, his expedition was doomed. As he trudged up the Rongbuk Glacier, Wilson quickly realized how much he was in over his head. He threw away crampons he found at an old camp, not understanding their life-saving purpose, and lost his way multiple times on the ice. His diary reveals a man caught between belief and physical struggle. He blamed his lack of progress on the weather, writing, "It's the weather that's beaten me. What damn bad luck." Still, Wilson pressed on. After one failed attempt, he returned to base, only to rest and head back up again with 2 Sherpas. The weather was worse this time, but Wilson's faith in his mission didn't falter. He climbed higher, reaching a point just below the North Col, where previous expeditions had turned back. His Sherpas begged him to stop, recognizing the dangers that Wilson, in his single-mindedness, refused to see. But Wilson persisted, pushing forward on his own. His last diary entry, dated May 31st, 1934, read, "Off again, gorgeous day." He was never seen alive again. The following year, his body was found by an expedition led by Eric Shipton, lying at the foot of the North Col. His tent had been ripped apart by the wind, and his rucksack, containing his diary, was scattered nearby. Wilson had died from a combination of exhaustion and exposure, another victim of the mountain's harsh realities. The truth is, Wilson's fate was sealed long before he ever reached Everest. He ignored the advice of experts, refused to learn the skills he needed, and underestimated the mountain at every turn. His belief that fasting and faith could conquer nature was his undoing. Everest didn't care about his spiritual journey. It only cared about the cold, hard reality of survival.